We're recording. Simona forgot to tell me to record it, so I've been out of practice.
Well, thank you, Forrest, and welcome to everybody to the Roy Branson Legacy Sabbath School and to the Jack Provonsha Legacy Sabbath School. We're meeting together again today to continue our discussion of Gary Chartier's book, Loving Creation, the Task of the Moral Life. We are doing chapter 4 today, and it's going to do a lot about how to relate the notion of love to our everyday life. So I would like to read two passages of scripture that are rarely read together, but I think they should be. This one is the Golden Rule. Now, when we talk about the Golden Rule, we often hear people say, do unto others as you would like them to do unto you, or you would prefer them to do unto you, or you would desire them to do unto you, and so forth. And that's appropriate because there is a psychological tinge to this, but in that word psychological, there's also the word logical. And we remember Dr. Chartier saying last week that the basic conceptual resources of ethics are as logically required as are those of mathematics. And that would be true of the Golden Rule. The Golden Rule has shown up many different places over the years because it is logically compelling. If we say equals in equal circumstances ought to be treated equally, we are saying the same thing as we would be saying if we are talking about the Golden Rule. So I would like to read first from Matthew, then I would like to turn over to Ephesians 5, where one sees the same kind of reasoning worked out in a different context. That is, the argument is, I unavoidably care for myself. The Bible doesn't question whether we have any self-regard. It takes that for granted. And that's true. If I poke you with a sharp instrument, you'll pull away. You love yourself, even if it's not always fully conscious. But in Ephesians, it says to the man, you care for your own body, and your wife's body is the same. Therefore, in my words, since there's no relevant difference between the two, you must treat her as you would treat yourself. There's no difference with respect to the matter at hand. So here we go. In everything, do to others as you would have them do to you, for this is the law and the prophets. So that's from Matthew 7. And now I go to Ephesians 5. And we'll walk our way through this. Husbands, love your wives just as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her in order to make her holy by cleansing her with the washing of water by the word, so as to present the church to himself as splendor, without a spot or wrinkle or anything of the kind. Yes, so that it may be holy and without blemish. Now here we go. In the same way, husbands should love their wives as they do their own bodies. He who loves his wife loves himself. For no one ever hates his own body, but he nourishes and tenderly cares for it, just as Christ does for the church. So this idea that with respect to the issue at hand, we are equal, and therefore it's logically required to treat each other equally, is right here in the text. For this reason, a man will leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and the two will become one flesh. This is a great mystery, and I am applying it to Christ and the church. Each of you, however, should love his own wife as himself, and a wife should respect her husband. So, the author of Ephesians is saying, husbands, you care for yourselves. with respect to the issues at hand, there is no relevant difference between you and your wife. Therefore, as the text says, in loving your wife, you are loving yourself. Or we could put it the other way around. In loving yourself, you're loving your wife. So that's the logic of the golden rule, and it compels people who know nothing about the Bible or any other religious resource of the West. So I think it's very, very important for us to keep this in mind in light of what Dr. Chartier said last week about the objective reality of these basic resources. Now, we didn't ask him to talk about how that view relates to perspectivalism, and I'd like to start there for just a little bit. How does his view of the objectivity of the basic resources of ethics deal with this issue of perspectivalism? And then we'll get right into the heart of the issue for today. Dear God, thank you again for Sabbath School. Thank you again for people who are gathering from all over to study together and to learn from each other. We pray that we will take seriously this idea of love and explore fruitfully the different ways it can be related to concrete situations. Thank you for Dr. Chartier, and we look forward to learning from him again today. In Christ's name, amen. Well, welcome back, Gary.
Good to be here, Dave.
Would you say just a word or two about how your views regarding the objective character of the basic resources of ethics relates to the emphasis on perspectivalism that we hear about today?
Well, so I guess what I would say is we can talk about something like that at the 40,000 foot level, or we can consider the actual considerations that are germane to particular claims, right? So if, let's say, for instance, when we think about something like the golden rule, it seems to me that somebody can perfectly well consider why that idea is is rationally compelling, right? That I'm taking certain considerations into account, and there's something fundamentally arbitrary about taking them into account in a different way in relation to one person rather than another, when there's no salient distinction to be made between one person and another in the instant case. I think we have to just talk about the specifics of the principles that we're trying to reflect on, and see whether indeed an attempt to object on some substantive ground turns out to be persuasive. So I don't think it's very helpful for somebody to say at the 40,000 foot level, oh, well, we all bring different perspectives to things. Well, I mean, undoubtedly that's true, but I'm not sure that it's very helpful or very informative when it comes to sorting out how we're going to think here, because sometimes those perspectives will be relevant and sometimes they will not be. And I guess my instinct here is that there are good reasons that we can offer for the various ways in which I think we ought to specify love. We ought to give love content. And for the moment, I'm inclined to stick with those.
Okay, I think I hear two things. One of them is that you would prefer to discuss this on a case-by-case basis rather than in an abstract theoretical way. And I also think I hear you saying, if I come to a judgment based on what I consider to be compelling logical reasons, the burden of proof is with the other person to suggest or to make the case that I'm not. Did you say that as well?
Yeah, so I didn't mean case by case as in individual by situation reasoning. I meant reasoning about the particular principles.
Okay. Okay.
We'd want to, and yeah, I think when we come up with a plausible account of these principles, then I think we're entitled to retain them as understandings of what it means to give love concreteness. And yeah, of course, somebody might challenge us in one way or another, and the challenge might be, might turn out to be right, and we might need to make revisions of one kind or another, or we might not. But failing a successful challenge, I don't think we need to be concerned about that. I don't think that perspectivalism in the abstract is a reason not to go ahead with what seems to us to make sense.
Okay, so now we turn to the chapter as such, and I would like to bring up a screen which has on it a number of different people that you discuss in your chapter. Only 7, I think, and we're going to concentrate on 6, maybe 5 of them. And I would like to say to all of us that the point here is not to have a seminar in recent religious thinkers about the moral life. That would be great. But here we want to do that, but we want to add to that Gary's understanding of his own position. So we're using these people to compare and contrast Gary's position so that we understand him. So there's a second level of concern there. But thirdly, we need to be asking ourselves what we think about these matters and how to relate the notion of love to concrete circumstances. So the cases are these people, then Gary's relationship to them, and then thirdly, our relationship to all of that. And with that, let me see if I can get the share screen up. Now I have here I have begun here with Leo Tolstoy, whom Gary mentions in passing. And I don't know how much you want to say about him, Gary, before we move on to more contemporary people.
So what I've tried to do in this chapter of the book is to talk about differences between my views as I try to spell them out of the book and the views of a number of Christian thinkers with an eye to clarifying what I'm up to, making, I hope, more apparent how the approach I'm taking can be helpfully distinguished from theirs. And so with that in mind, then, giving the reader a better sense of what I'm up to. So I'm not trying to engage in the definitive exegesis of the work of any of these figures. I'm simply trying to talk about them in a way that will be helpful in enabling the reader to get a better sense of what I'm trying to do in the book. The idea here is, of course, that love has been a tremendously important theme in Christian ethics. And so lots of different people find themselves talking about love in Christian ethics in different ways. And so I start out in the chapter by thinking about what I talk about as love as immediate response, right? So the idea here is that love is best understood as a kind of immediate, beneficent reaction to whoever we happen to encounter. And so I mentioned Tolstoy as one nominal proponent of this sort of view, with the idea that we might think about love that way. And so I try to explain how my view is different from that view, and it differs in a whole host of ways. But I think perhaps the single most important distinction is that the idea of commitments of various kinds, that idea is central to my view. And the idea here, therefore, is that we invest deeply in certain projects of various sorts. And that's quite different from the kind of zigzagging pattern of life that it seems as if the kind of Tolstoyan approach, if we took it seriously, might involve. And I think there are other ways in which that Tolstoyan approach might not ultimately be consistent with love as I understand it as well. It might fall foul of fairness in various ways. It certainly might not be efficient in one way or another, but I think the concern with it's certainly I think the concern with commitments might be the single most significant difference. So I start off by noting that robust identities, robust investment in various projects is part of love as I understand it. And that's inconsistent with the hither, thither, and yon, reactive in the moment kind of approach that we might associate with, if not with Tolstoy, then with what is sometimes talked about as a Tolstoyan approach to Christian ethics.
Okay, could you say a little bit more about what you mean by immediate response? You've just used the expression reactive in the moment. Maybe we could use a concrete case. Suppose a person is considering having an abortion. How would this love as immediate response or reactive in the moment relate to that issue? Now, I'm talking about not in general, the theory or abortion in general. But here's a concrete woman facing the possibility of having an abortion. What would Tolstoy's approach be to that?
So I am assuming, though I don't know this, and I don't think this is integral to what I am describing as love as immediate response, but I'm assuming that Tolstoy would have taken the view that love in the immediate moment includes just acting beneficently to whoever we happen to bump into. And so I am assuming, I think the standard Tolstoyan view, as I understand it, is pacifist, would be nonviolent, and therefore presuming that Tolstoy took the fetus to be a morally considerable individual, I assume Tolstoy wouldn't think that abortion was a live option in the first place, not so much because reactive love in the moment was involved, but because nonviolence was a constraint for him. I think the idea, as I understand it, of this sort of approach is that we're going about the day and going about our activities in the day, and we encounter various people, and we're just redirected on an ongoing basis in virtue of our encounters with those people as we respond beneficently to them in one way or another. And so I don't know. Certainly, I think for Tolstoy, again, I think abortion is going to be ruled out on this other ground, and he's going to treat the fetus as protected by something like what I've talked about as respect. But as a more general matter, I think the idea is that whoever I encounter in the course of the day, I have a kind of person-to-person encounter with that individual, and I just respond beneficently to that person, and that means abandoning or ignoring for the moment whatever else I might be up to. That's the way I take the view to work.
Okay, so encounter by encounter, one does the most beneficial thing in that encounter. And I guess one has some intuitive awareness of what that would be.
I guess, yeah.
Okay. And yet, having said all that, this is framed within a nonviolent parameter, right? So it's not totally wide open, but these case by case, circumstance by circumstance, encounter by encounter, these events all are handled within that larger frame of reference. Is that correct?
I think that's right, as an account of what I take Tolstoy to be up to. So I don't explicitly in this first brief section of the chapter talk about the avoidance of any kind of purposeful harm, but I do think that's definitely part of the package that we often associate with Tolstoy. Definitely.
Okay, I see Simona would like to ask a question or make a comment.
Yeah, my question is, so in view of his work, how would you define violence? For example, in Anna Karenina, we are talking about a young woman who is definitely basically sold into marriage, has no way of asserting any kind of freedom. Isn't that violence as well? And he basically supports that view that whatever she's doing as a result, her affair or infidelity or whatever, is wrong in the context of the society in which she lives. Yet she is a victim of violence. Her freedom has been basically taken away from her.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. Again, how Tolstoy would respond there. I take it he would want to say not at all that the only way or the only significant way or the only serious way in which we can wrong people is by engaging in physical harm. He certainly doesn't think that. But I also take him to have the view when he espouses some kind of pacifism, the content of the pacifism, I take it, is given particularly by avoidance of physical harm. Of course, I guess he's also going to say, even if he supposes that the society, various people within the society, parents and teachers and peers and so forth, act wrongly by pressuring someone like Anna into her marriage and so forth. And even if he were to categorize that as violence, I think he'd want to say, let's use the word violence more carefully, narrowly than that. But even if he wanted to say that was violence, I think he would say, as a pacifist, that's kind of irrelevant to the question what she does, because she's not permitted, on his view, to respond in any way that's going to qualify either broadly or narrowly as violence. So, I mean, it's, I think his view, and I'm no expert on Tolstoy, but I just think his view is going to be one of kind of radical passivity. Finally,
yeah, that's what I don't think he's pacifist. He's pacifist. He just doesn't want reaction. He doesn't believe that any form of reaction that is going to upset the boat is acceptable, whether it's physical reaction or any other form of reaction. So it's passivity, not pacifism.
I think that's a good point. Now, Gary mentions Tolstoy in passing, and I wonder if we should move on to the next person, unless, Gary, you have something more to say here.
I think I want to make sure that I don't create any illusion that I have anything very wise to say about Count Leo Tolstoy himself.
Okay, so here we go. Thank you, Simona, and thank you, Gary. Joseph Fletcher.
Yeah, so here we have in Joseph Fletcher, we have somebody who, of course, went through a considerable shift over time. beginning his professional life as an Episcopal priest and ending life as an atheist. Again, it's important probably not to make the focus of our conversation, Fletcher, the three-dimensional flesh and blood individual. But I can spin off of Fletcher at least, because I think Fletcher offers a particularly blunt and direct expression of one approach to doing Christian ethics. And so Fletcher finds himself telling us, notably in his most famous book, Situation Ethics, that in the situation by situation, we ought to do the most loving thing. But he's very clear, first of all, when he says that he's not talking about the sort of Tolstoyan view, and he deliberately rejects that, naming Tolstoy. He doesn't take the view that what we should do is respond caringly to the particular person in front of us in the moment. And so it's not always clear then what he does mean, but when he starts talking about institutional questions or policy questions, he makes very clear that what he means is bringing about the best consequences. He talks about the agapist, the proponent of love, as he understands that person, embracing, making common cause with the utilitarian. And so he thinks that what we ought to do is to try in any given case to select that option of those open to us that will bring about, quote, the most good, the best consequences, where best consequences here means something like the consequences embodying the most welfare. That's seems to be the way he cashes this out. And this means, for instance, that we can find Fletcher, saying things like, he is, he thinks it was entirely appropriate for Harry Truman to authorize the atomic bombing of non-combatants in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, because on balance, that was the way to bring about the most good. And so what I try to suggest here is that this approach, this understanding of love as the promotion of good consequences, is problematic in a variety of ways. And we can talk about several of those, but the most significant here, again, I think, is that I believe that the whole notion that Fletcher's operating with, this idea of the best outcome in any given case, is, as a general matter, a kind of nonsense expression. It doesn't mean anything. If we add up the weight of my computer and the length of my pants and the circumference of the table I'm sitting next to, we can come up with a number if we want to, but that's not a number that actually has any meaning. And I think doing that is something like what happens when we try to somehow aggregate all of the goods involved in any given state of affairs. Now, there's a further problem, which is that our ability to predict what's going to result from our actions, especially over the long term, is profoundly difficult. But even if we were somehow omniscient in a way that we're not, the whole idea that Fletcher's pushing, the whole conception of love he's pushing, in which the loving action is the one that brings about the most, quote, the most good, is a nonsense notion, because the notion of the most good is, I think, just an incoherent notion. The various goods that are involved in a particular situation are qualitatively different. And because they're qualitatively different, there's no way, as it were, to aggregate them you know, and then aggregating them, you know, quantitatively becomes necessary for the comparison that's required if we're going to say there's more good here than there is there. And so because of that, I think the whole approach that Fletcher takes fails at takeoff. And I talk about this a bit earlier in the book in talking about the specifications of love, but just as a reminder of it here, I reassert that. I think so. Fletcher's approach to love, I think, is a non-starter.
Well, many people have noted that it's difficult to predict what the best consequences would be. I don't remember many people making your point that the word best has no clear meaning because there is no one good, but there are many goods, several goods anyway. And I think that returning to the idea of several goods rather than one good is one of the distinctive features of your book all the way through. You seem to be really reluctant to say that there's only one form of excellence, but there are a variety of forms of excellence, and therefore to pursue the one is inherently impossible. Could you comment on that?
Yeah, and I mean, I don't claim any originality here at all, you know. And I think what I try to do here is a reflection of things again that are said by others, whom I footnote in that earlier chapter, in which I begin to lay out the discussion of different aspects of well-being. And for those who already have the book, that's easy to document, and I'm happy again to provide that to those who don't have it. But yeah, I think that once we begin to recognize that there are many different ways in which a life can go well, and therefore many different ways in which different, particular goods can be configured in a life that's going well, then it becomes much more difficult to make the kind of move that somebody like Fletcher wants to make. And I think that's, you can certainly achieve excellence in lots of different ways. You can combine goods in your life in a whole range of ways. And if you're acting lovingly with respect to yourself or with respect to other people, other creatures, it's just important to recognize that variety of goods. And I think when we do that, we're freed up, I think, from the kind of obsessive concern that some people will have with, finding the one right approach. We also just recognize the immense variety of characteristics and dimensions of flourishing, dimensions of fulfillment or well-being or welfare that there are. So yeah, I do think that it's a really crucial aspect of love, that if love is about well-being and well-being comes in many different shapes and sizes, we need to keep that idea from ever coming out of focus.
Okay, Joseph Fletcher has a clear position on abortion, and I don't really want to get into that, but could you quickly indicate how he would reason about whether this specific person that we're considering this morning, how would he reason to his conclusion here? Not what his conclusion is, but how would he go about getting to it?
Yeah, so it seems to me that Fletcher would invite us to imagine the woman in this case who's deciding whether or not to ask medical personnel to perform the abortion. I mean, or perhaps, maybe it's even simpler. Let's even assume that she's able to consume a safe abortifacient, so that their involvement is minimal, and there's no question about their activities. Maybe she's able to just pick something up at a clinic. In any case, she needs to make this decision. So she's going to make a decision taking into account what she believes to be the consequences of various choices, the consequences for her, the consequences for the fetus if it comes to term as over against if it is prevented from doing so by the abortion, but the consequences for other people involved in various ways. We might again, we have to know more about her situation. Maybe she's a teenager who can't care for a child. Maybe she's married, has had an affair and doesn't want to reveal that. Maybe she's a professional person who she's about to start a medical residency and simply can't focus on a child. There may be any number of reasons she might think about this. Maybe there are health considerations for her or for the fetus that are driving her reflection on the question. In any case, Fletcher invites her to think about the different streams of causation that might flow from her choice. She acts in a given way or doesn't act in a given way. What will be the likely results for her, for the fetus, for anyone else if she, let's say, takes the abortifacient. And so then he assumes that what we can do once we identify those consequences is that we can identify the goods in play in those consequences and sum them up. And we can compare the different streams of causation flowing from different choices on her part and determine which stream involves the most good if all the various kind of bits of welfare involved add up in different ways and in different cases. She can identify those and choose the one that embodies the most, quote, good.
Okay, so she adds up all the consequences for one course of action, adds up all the consequences for the other, and she chooses the one she thinks is best. Now, does she weight her own consequences for herself any more highly than the consequences for anybody else?
No, the idea is what Fletcher is inviting us to do is to take up what the distinguished 19th century utilitarian Henry Sidgwick called the point of view of the universe. And so to think about herself, but to think about all the others involved with the same kind of attachment and the same weight in each case.
That's interesting, because one might intuitively think that the woman would have more to say about it, but not according to this point of view. Just a couple of things. Joseph Fletcher was our guest once at Loma Linda, and he turned out to be a very congenial man. You can see by this picture that he is such that he began by saying, "I'm 81 years old, which means I don't have time to waste on issues that are not controversial. I want to talk only about controversial issues because I have so little time." So he made a case for a voluntary act of euthanasia, and a man named Matthew Connolly, also an Episcopalian from UCLA, gave the other point of view. There's another aspect to this, though. It is well known that he became an atheist. What perhaps is not so widely known is why. And apparently, from what I understand, it was the same issue that affects everybody. And that is, he looked at the suffering of the world and he finally concluded it was not harmonious with the idea of a loving God, and that he didn't look at the suffering of the world in general, but as he watched someone very close to him die of cancer. And going through that process was more than his theological resources could withstand. So it's tragic, but I highlight it because that's the one issue that's most likely to cause any of us to stumble. That is the question of suffering.
Of course.
Okay, here we go. Here we go to the next one. Paul Ramsey.
So I devote a tremendous amount of attention in this chapter to Paul Ramsey because I think Paul Ramsey was such a thoughtful and richly complex thinker who had so much of value to say. And, I would be inclined to suspect that, Ramsey would qualify as the most important English language Christian ethicist of his generation. And he had a great deal to say about a whole range of issues over time. But love was always of real importance to Ramsey, whether he was talking about bioethics, whether he was talking about the ethics of war and peace, whether he was talking about anything else. Ramsey, in his first book, Basic Christian Ethics, starts out, on my view, sounding a great deal like Fletcher. He offers considerations he takes to support an ethic of love, and he encourages us to embrace that ethic of love when he seems to kind of imagine how that works out in practice. What he has in mind, as far as I can tell, is very much like Ramsey's. We're going to choose the most loving thing to do in the given case, with the interesting exception that we ought to discount our own well-being entirely. So he assumes that we might kind of, in the second round, as it were, we might end up doing things that benefit ourselves, but the justification for doing so will be that doing so is the most loving thing for everybody else concerned. So it's hard to, I think, finally see a tremendous justification for this, but for this exclusion, which is again even more alienating than Fletcher's, but it's very much part of the way he spells things out in the book. What's clear is that this is, as it were, a view that I take it kind of commends itself to Ramsey in the abstract. He's trying to work out a position that is clear and precise, and I think philosophically sophisticated, that reflects what he's learned from other Protestant thinkers, notably Reinhold Niebuhr, who's one of the people who recommended the book for publication, and probably also Anders Nygren, whose book Agape and Eros we had occasion to think about earlier in the course of our discussion of this of my book. Nygren's distinction between Agape and Eros certainly was important, but I think just captured a way of thinking that was quite common among Protestants at the time. What seems to happen to Ramsey in the next few years.
Nice to see the hummingbird out here too.
Oh, I'm sorry, someone is needing to be muted. Let's continue.
I got it, David.
Okay.
Yeah. Anyway, what happens to Ramsey, it seems to me, in the next few years after he publishes Basic Christian Ethics is Joe Fletcher. It seems to me he finds himself in conflict first with Fletcher over questions of method in Christian ethics, and then with, probably a range of what he thinks are naive and unsophisticated pronouncements by church groups. That seems to be his other immediate target. And so he finds himself thinking about the ethics of war and peace. He finds himself thinking about the ethics of sex. And in both kinds of cases, he thinks that Fletcher can't be right. And it seems to me he thinks Fletcher can't be right because, as he starts to kind of spell out how this works, he ends up talking a lot, and I think this doesn't really capture everything he'd want to say or everything we'd want to say and trying to make sense of his view, but he ends up talking a lot about covenant. And what he seems to have in mind really with the language of covenant is the language is stability and focus. And he thinks these things are lacking from Fletcher's approach. So that Fletcher isn't a Tolstoy, and he vigorously, indeed kind of aggressively rejects a kind of Tolstoyan approach, but there is no sort of continuity in action that a utilitarian approach like Fletcher's can involve, right? Because from moment to moment, the utilitarian is asking, what can I do right now that will bring about the most good? And that might or might not have any particular pattern, order, structure, and so forth. And Ramsey thinks that the moral life must have pattern, order, structure. It must be marked by covenant. And so he certainly thinks that it's marked by covenant in the sense of deep, stable, reliable, trustworthy relationships formed consensually between people, if we're talking about, say, marriage partners or physician and patient. But I think he's really getting at a concern more generally with kind of reliability, structure, and order. He thinks that if we are to love, we have to love in ways that are trustworthy, that are predictable aspects of common life, of social life. And so much of the time, then he ends up, I think, again, at least officially, rejecting positions like Fletcher's, because he seems to be taking a kind of practice consequentialist view. And by practice consequentialism, I mean the view that instead of asking, which choice should I make in the moment that will bring about the most good, rather, we ought to be evaluating social practices as practices that are, given available alternative practices, those that are most likely to bring about the most good. And we ought to then adhere to the inherent constraints of the practices that will bring about the most good. I think Ramsey ends up doing probably a bit more than that. There's certainly, I think, the idea of respect for persons, which isn't captured just in terms of consistency there. But I think that idea of embracing practices that are loving, and then as a result, not adverting to the question, what's the most loving in any given instance, but rather asking about the practice, that turns out to be a pretty crucial aspect of the way Ramsey wants to proceed. Clearly, you can't think about promises or covenants when you're thinking about justice in wartime, which he devotes a lot of attention to. He thinks that, not the principle of non-combatant immunity, let us say, for instance, is a principle of love. It's a principle of regard for persons that we can work out as a matter of love. And I think it's a bit of a stretch to say that involves a covenant between combatants on opposite sides of a military conflict, but it reflects the same basic idea of a kind of stable, reliable treatment of people and a respectful treatment of people. There's a lot going on in Ramsey, and before I say any more about Ramsey and about what I try to argue in this portion of the chapter, Dave, I just wonder if you have anything you want to toss into the mix as somebody who had some acquaintance personally with Ramsey, as I never did, and who certainly came of age at a point where Ramsey was a hugely important figure in Christian ethics.
Right. I'm happy to say something. But would I first summarize your understanding of Ramsey as saying love is practiced as faithfulness to covenant?
That certainly seems to me to be a hugely important theme for him.
Okay. He, of course, taught at Princeton University all of his life. He was a son of a Methodist minister, and he grew up a pacifist. But reading the writings of Reinhold Niebuhr and observing what happened in World War II, he moved from that to just war thinking and brought just war thinking into the Protestant fold from Catholicism. He was a bigger than life person in size and in character and in commitment. He was not convivial. Joseph Fletcher was convivial. Paul Ramsey held people, related to people in a loving way, if we understand love to mean respect and dignity and proprieties, things like that. He was not chummy, let's put it that way. And I think it's right that he relied more and more on Immanuel Kant, whereas Joseph Fletcher relied more and more on Bentham and the utilitarians. And I think at one point, Ramsey said that Kant was the good fortune of Christian ethics. So, yeah. Now, my own relationship to him concerns some of the things we did at Loma Linda. Two things in particular. One of them was the Baby Faye project, in which Dr. Bailey transplanted the heart of a primate, a baboon, into the heart of a baby whose heart was in big trouble. And he strongly objected to that to me, thumping on my chest on one occasion about it. And his view was that this was an unjustified medical experiment that exploited the baby. And I pushed back and said, I think that Dr. Bailey did have a therapeutic intent, but it wasn't merely experimental, but it was a therapeutic experiment. And I mentioned to him that many surgical interventions have been failures for a while before they finally became successful. And I said, bypass surgery is one of those. And he cussed his chest and said, oh, I just had one of those myself. And so that kind of softened his view on that. The other one, though, he didn't soften at all, was the anencephaly project, where we sought to acquire transplantable organs from babies who were born with anencephaly without violating the law or the expectations of medical ethics. And at that point, he was just, I wouldn't say beside himself, but he was just very, very much alarmed. This happened at the Society for Christian Ethics meetings, where he gave his final farewell speech, and everybody knew it was. After that, he came out and sat in the foyer for a while. He was so tired, and I was there, also unable to sit in that meeting all that time. So I was out there, and we got to talking, and he was just adamant, irrevocably adamant that what we were doing was pure and simple exploitation of vulnerable babies born with anencephaly. And I tried to push back on that. And whether it was because he was not feeling well, he was clearly dying, or because he was just so shocked and appalled by what we were doing, or probably some combination of both, I was not able to make any progress with him on that issue. Tremendous and powerful man, as you've said, Gary.
Yeah. Thanks, Dave. And I encourage you to toss in as we continue any further observations you have, not just about Ramsey the man, about whom I'm always glad to hear more, but also about Ramsey the very insightful thinker. So what I try to do here, first of all, is to spell out what I think is going on in Ramsey's thought, and then to explain where I think the approach that I take differs from his. In one case, so one thing certainly I want to highlight is that I don't take this sort of asymmetric view of self and other that he embraces. I think that fairness, it seems to me, doesn't require us at all to exclude ourselves from consideration in the way that he supposes, and try to both highlight how he keeps, that it seems very clear what he's saying, and why I don't think that's finally decisive. I affirm the the covenantal approach that Ramsey takes and try to work that out with an idea with a greater focus on fairness on the one hand and commitment on the other, as I hope offering some clarity to an approach that at least isn't very different from his there. I suggest that Ramsey doesn't provide sufficient attention to this idea of well-being, and particularly the idea of well-being as variegated. I think he might, he rejects at one point in his later writing the idea that we can choose the greatest good, but that may sometimes really just be a matter of his rejecting the idea that we do this situationally rather than focusing on practices that are productive of, quote, the greatest good. And I want to push back and suggest that he needs a more complex and rich conception of well-being. I suggest that while it certainly is important when we're thinking about how institutions operate, to think about those institutions as operating in accordance with stable, reliable practices and rules. When we think about the choices we make as individuals, I don't think that we choose appropriately when we ask just about, as it were, the rules of the game. And I do think we can't help but ask about what's going on in a particular situation. It's just that I don't think that then commits us to some kind of consequentialism or utilitarianism. Rather, we can ask about fairness, about respect, about commitment, and so forth. And these things, I think, are what constrain our choices, but we can apply them in quite situationally specific ways. They impose limitations, they impose constraints that yield continuity in our choices, but we don't, I think, it's hard not to end up engaged in a kind of rule worship, I'm afraid, if we end up just asking about following the rules that produce the most consequences. So again, I think there's a lot to learn from Ramsey, and the focus on respect for persons, the focus on non-combatant immunity, which was always important for him, the focus on covenant fidelity. All of these things seem tremendously important, and his awareness of the fact that we can develop an ethic of love that doesn't look like Tolstoy or Fletcher seems very important to me. So I've got tremendous respect for Ramsey, and he is indeed one of the people to whom I've dedicated this book. At the same time, I think we can move beyond the kind of rule utilitarian focus that seems to be his developed alternative in theory to positions like Fletcher's.
Yeah, so a couple more comments for me. I think it's clear, to use some jargon, that he moved from act utilitarianism to rule utilitarianism to Kantianism over the course of time. And in that direction, he became more convinced that there are some rules that absolutely never can be violated. Absolutely never. And in that respect, he was sort of like Kant. There are just some things that are beyond negotiation. And none of the people we have considered so far would say that. And I don't think any of those that will follow will say that. But his rule, now he doesn't have a ton of them, but he has a few rules, like not intentionally harming innocent people. There's no justification for any possible exception to that in his conviction, and he was intellectually and emotionally committed to that, and it was very, very impressive. Now, one more thing. I think he was right in a way about what we did at Loma Linda. And now that I look back on it, I think he was right in a way, but for a different reason. Because as the years have gone by, it has seemed to me that we should have been putting more emphasis on things going on in the School of Public Health and putting more resources there, because the things we were involved in were high tech, and they would serve at high cost a small number of people. And I've become increasingly persuaded that we should focus. I'm not opposed to this, but we should, in a more balanced way, emphasize prevention, education, public health measures, and so forth. And I think we have become unbalanced. We should have a very strong Department of Surgery, but that should not be the only thing we're doing. I really have become quite convinced of that. Now, Leonard Bailey, the transplant surgeon, would agree with that, because at work, he was very much a surgeon on the edge of experimental surgery, but he and his wife, Nancy, were very much involved personally in relieving world hunger projects. So he had in his own experience both sides, but I think we have maybe an opportunity to become here more balanced. Now, it's time for us to take a break. And after we take a break, I'm going to suggest, Gary, that we skip Timothy Jackson and go straight to Jack Provonsha, if that's okay with you, because I don't think Jackson is as influential as the others that we have been considering. But if you really think we should stay with Jackson, I'm happy to. What do you think?
No, that's fine if you'd like to do that.
Okay, so when we come back, we will talk about Jack Provonsha, and of course from Loma Linda for many, many years. And Gary has great respect for him and has learned much from him, Gary says, but also has some penetrating analysis and appraisal of what Jack wrote, and he brings up important weaknesses in Jack's method. I'd like to start off, though, when we come back, with a funny story about when I first met Jack Provonsha when I was about 14 years old. Okay, let's take a break.
Okay.
10 minutes from now.
Yeah, David, let's say 11:45 here.
11:45. Okay.
Stop recording.
And let's begin with looking at this comment by Gary in the chat. He says, no need to dwell on this. Well, I think it is important, but I hope it is clear that I take the various specifications of love, which he outlined earlier in the book, to be exceptionless. There is no passing on the golden rule or the Pauline principle. Do you want to say anything more about that, Gary?
Yeah, just that you noted that this was an area of contrast between Ramsey and others about whom we were speaking, and I'm just saying that I at the 40,000 foot level, I'm with Ramsey. Now, that doesn't mean that in each particular case in which Ramsey thinks there's an exceptionless requirement, he and I would agree about that. But I certainly, let's say in rejecting, purposeful attacks on non-combatants, I think I'm happy to line up with Ramsey on that, for instance. And so I'm just noting my concurrence there.
Right. I think my guess is that someone like Fletcher would say, well, doing it the way I do it is in fact fulfilling the golden rule, and so forth and so on. And I think you're right. Therefore, it's not at the high level, but it gets down to the concrete cases as to how exceptionless these rules are. I think the more concrete and specific the rule is, the more exceptions there are. The more abstract and general the rule is, the fewer exceptions, justifiable exceptions there are. Do you want to say anything more about that?
Well, so I think, again, the principle of respect, as I lay it out, precludes purposeful attacks on basic aspects of well-being. And I think, again, that doesn't mean that there can't be actions that in one way or another inadvertently injure. But I also think it's not just a matter of semantics to say that we're ruling out those purposeful attacks. I think that does exclude some kinds of some action types generically.
Okay. All right, so we moved to Jack Provonsha. And quickly, a little story. When I was an early teen living in the Northern California Conference, my father was a minister, my mother was an English teacher. We would gather together with other ministers' families and other doctors' families once a year for a weekend at a resort called Hoberg's in Northern California. And we went there during the wintertime. So there was always snow and so forth for the youngsters to play in. And they would have meetings in the big auditorium they had there. So one of the meetings was entitled something like Contemporary Issues in Adventism. And instead of playing outside in the snow, I went in and listened to the conversation because I thought it was very fascinating. One part of it was humorous, but the other part was very serious. The first part that I thought was humorous then, and I do now, was that one of the first questions was this: what should we do about our church members who are women? What should we do about our women church members who are arriving at church in seamless hose? And the concern was that seamless hose made it appear as though the women were wearing no hose at all. And so there was a little bit of push back and forth on that issue. So now to the serious one. Jack was there to talk about the issue of hypnosis. And some of you will remember that at about that time, late 50s, early 60s, hypnosis was very much up front and in headlines and so forth. So he was there to discuss hypnosis, and the people gave their positions. One group of people said, this is not to be done by Adventists. Others said, well, we shouldn't be so stuck in the 19th century. We should be willing to use hypnosis and so forth. Now let's hear what Dr. Provonsha had to say. And he made an interesting move, I thought. He sided with neither group, but he said, let's turn to the writings of Ellen White. And he said, I'm not trying to, or imply, I can't remember if he said or implied it. I'm not trying to use her as an authority, but I want to point out something she says that makes sense and is very helpful in a case like this. And he turned to that passage, which we all know very well, that human beings are created in the image of God with the power to think and to do. The power to think and to do. And his view was that we should not be engaging in hypnosis because it reduced the patient's capacity to be a self-governing individual. It increased the patient's likelihood of being more vulnerable to the manipulation of others. Two things about that. One is that way of dealing with the issue of hypnosis turned out to be the way he dealt with most of the other issues. That is, he said actions that increase an individual's power to think and to do were right. Things that decreased a person's power to think and to do were wrong. But when he took this to the larger world, he called that principle agape. And so that's he took something straight out of Ellen White, reworded it, refashioned it, made it more subtle and refined, and then put it out into the actual world. Gary will tell us about that. The other thing, though, is I sat there when I was just an early teen listening to that. I said to myself, well, he's outlined a principle, and if in some particular case hypnosis did increase the patient's power to think and to do, even though Jack Provonsha had not said that, wouldn't that the principle he articulated justify hypnosis in that instance? And decades later, I asked him about it, and I said, Jack, you use this principle to condemn hypnosis in many cases, but could not somebody use the same principle to justify it in some other cases? And he said, yeah, that's right. So he didn't develop the other side of it on that occasion, but that shows how that idea of sticking close to what increases or decreases a person's power to think and to do was central to all of his thinking. And with that, over to Gary.
Yeah, thanks, Dave. So, as you note, I've been honored to facilitate conversations in the what we're now calling the Jack Provonsha Legacy class, which which I inherited from you, and you inherited from Fritz, and Fritz inherited from Jack. So there's certainly an indirect connection there. But I'm very honored to be in that line of intellectual descent. Jack is somebody I never had the privilege of knowing well. He retired at about the same time I began as a student at what was then still Loma University. I interviewed him once for the Criterion, had occasion to, to interact with him occasionally after that in fairly limited ways. The last time, I guess, being at a dinner, which I guess must have been in honor of his 80th birthday that I remember you're having put together, Dave. And I don't remember where it was. I just remember a number of us sitting around a kind of square conference room in a restaurant, a conference room with no windows. I don't remember where that was, but anyway. Jack's book, You Can't Come Home Again, was certainly one of the first things I ever read as an adolescent, trying to actually think theologically. I went on toward the beginning of college to read God Is With Us, which I still think is perhaps Jack's best book, and have appreciated over time, in retrospect, how much I think it's clear I learned from him, not only through those books, but also from his contribution, a crisp little essay on creation and Christian ethics in the book that came to be called Remnant and Republic, that Charles Teal edited, drawing on contributions to a lecture series that he had put together on Adventism and ethics the lectures happened in 87, 88, or 88, 89. I'm forgetting which now. I think 87, 88. In other words, Dave also contributed to that volume. So Jack's been somebody from whom it's been a real pleasure to learn over the years, and who placed a really great and I think salutary emphasis on creation as the ground of Christian ethics. And in the front pages of this book, there's a passage there's a page where I'm quoting, little, epigrams from various people, and several of those are from Jack, whom I'm very pleased to recognize in that way. So, as with Ramsey, so with Provonsha, these are people with whom I find occasion to disagree, but people whose insights have been, I think, very, very valuable to me and to others. So Jack makes, it seems to me, a really interesting move in thinking about ethics, and as Dave says, in kind of talking about how we might think about Christian ethics. So in this period when Jack is becoming an increasingly visible and vocal participant in conversations about Christian ethics, this idea that love is the central theme in Protestant ethics becomes increasingly central, increasingly important, and you find people like Fletcher, like Ramsey, talking about this, and particularly using the language of agape to talk about it. Now, as I noted at the beginning of the book, I think that contemporary linguistic scholarship, New Testament scholarship, would cause us to be quite hesitant about making the moves that some earlier generations, a couple of earlier generations, made in this regard. But this was the way in which I think it was very common to talk, that agape was seen as the distinctive element of Christian ethics. And generally, as we've noted with Ramsey or with Fletcher in different ways, but I think, in some ways similar, talk about agape and Christian ethics meant talk about, broadly speaking, benevolence or beneficence. So what Jack does in trying to develop a model of Christian ethics that picks up on this common way of talking, this way of talking that's so common in Christian ethics at the time he's really kind of refining his own thinking, the time he's writing his doctoral dissertation at Claremont, is a move which I hope I won't mischaracterize here, because I think it's subtle and really quite interesting. And what I take him to do is to say, when we think about how we might interact with each other, the first thing to think about in terms of interpersonal obligation is not so much what is the benevolent thing to do, the agapeic thing to do, but what is it that enables people to be agapeic? What is it that makes it possible for people to exercise creative freedom? So obviously people can exercise creative freedom in ways that we wouldn't recognize as loving. And I think, this is complicated. Love and creative freedom, agape and creative freedom can't be just the same thing. But Jack sees creative freedom as central to agape. And, I think we'll find people talking in this way in the then contemporary Protestant conversation. But what he says is, okay, if that's what agape is, then what we want is to make choices that will make space for agape. We want to make choices that will leave room for the exercise of creative freedom. And this then tells us how we treat particular persons in just the way that Dave has suggested. We think about as, say, for instance, say the question here of hypnosis, are we respectful of and enhancing the capacity for creative freedom, or are we undermining it? Are we attacking it in one way or another? And this also, for Jack, then helps to determine who counts in moral questions. And of course, those issues are very relevant to the discussions of the issues that Dave was mentioning earlier as causing such controversy between the Loma Linda school, if you will, on the one hand, and somebody like Paul Ramsey on the other hand, because Jack's view seems to me to be, or to have been, roughly that full-on, unqualified moral standing is the property of those with the capacity to exercise creative freedom, to engage in agape. And so if what we're doing is respecting and fostering and not attacking or undermining the capacity for agape, the capacity for the exercise of creative freedom, then it will obviously matter that particular potential targets of our action, I'm trying to find as neutral a way of talking about them as possible, either do or don't have this capacity to exercise creative freedom. So that then is the general model. And so that means that it really is an approach that says that, first and foremost, we're concerned with rational adult humans. And then there's a kind of development of the capacity to reason here and to exercise, as Dave said, the power to think and to do, that's acquired over time. and then we might also be interested in other things because they either facilitate our capacity to exercise creative freedom, or Jack suggested at various points, maybe we ought to be concerned about living entities, or perhaps non-living entities for that matter, that in some way symbolize, even if they don't themselves fully embody this capacity. And so thus he finds a way to try to bring in, as it were, through the back door, moral patients who are not as obviously able to exercise creative freedom. So it's an approach in which persons, those who have this capacity, are really central. And while, there's a way in which the approach is certainly influenced by a Kantian idea of respect for persons, as Jack works it out, it definitely doesn't involve exceptionless rules. That was actually, for me, one of the more interesting realizations as I got to know Jack's ideas better. That Jack, who I think, fundamentally was a person who, on balance, was and sought to be, if you will, a conservative Adventist, somebody who took the Adventist tradition seriously, the Adventist community seriously, and wanted to affirm those things. But he wasn't somebody who wanted to embrace the idea of exceptionless rules, which I think is something you probably would have found in a more traditional Adventist view. So that was a kind of surprise. So anyway, that's a kind of general outline. Jack's view is complex. It's not really like anybody else's view I can think of. And so before we go on to talk about some things that I think are worth saying about, how I would agree and disagree, how I want to distinguish my view from Jack's, maybe I can just ask Dave, number one, if there's anything he wants to add about just kind of explicating the core of Jack's view. I should also add, this is one thing I do want to add. Jack talks a lot about creation as the ground of ethics, and partly that's a matter of saying that this capacity for creative freedom is created. Sometimes I find Jack moving beyond that and talking about sort of the structure of creation as providing independent grounds for kind of limits on what counts as a good action, and we can certainly come back to that. There's a sense sometimes that a certain kind of action is just impious in relation to the creator, in a way that isn't really, it seems to me, an expression of this direct concern with creative freedom. But again, we can talk more about that. But yeah, before I go on to say anything else about my approach in relation to Jack's, Dave, I just wonder if there's any more you want to say about just explicating Jack's view, or about Jack more generally.
Okay, two things. I want to emphasize what you have said so well, and that is, when Jack approached the situation, he did not ask, what is the most loving thing to do? He asked, what can we do to maximize the capacity of people to act in a loving way? Which has been summarized by Gary as creative freedom. What can we do to make it possible for people in creative freedom to love? Okay, so I'm just emphasizing what Gary has said. The only thing I would add is that he began with hypnosis, and he used this on issue after issue after issue over the years as they came up. And to me, it's a fascinating account of how a person takes something very simple from his own religious tradition and transforms it in a way that's helpful to the wider community. And I think we should see more of that. But that's all I'd like to say, Gary. Thanks.
Thanks. So before I say anything else, Simona, you've got a question that I assume relates to where we've been so far. So instead of making you wait till the end, let's maybe we can engage now about your question.
Yeah, so my question, I was listening to all this, and all I hear is lots of very dry, quote unquote, rational thinking about, certain aspects of love and well-being. Where are emotions in all this? You know, I think no human being is 100% rational. We all have emotions. We act on them. We are driven by them. And in that respect, you know, issues of altruism, of sacrifice, of, you know, selfless love, things like that, you know, they're completely missing from all these views that you have, you know, mentioned so far. And in the second, maybe just something that seems quite common is that there have been no female thinkers mentioned at all in all this. So where are they?
So there are lots of different issues that you've touched on, and nothing I'm going to say is going to be adequate with respect to any of them, but just very quickly. So I think that the approach that I've taken, that I want to take here, goes back at least as far as Aristotle. And I think Aristotle and his heir, Thomas Aquinas, both think that how we develop emotionally, how we develop our emotional responses, how we educate our emotions, if you will, turns out to be hugely important for how we go about acting. We don't, when we live on a day-to-day basis, we don't spend our time reflecting ordinarily in the abstract. The emphasis that people like Aristotle and Aquinas place is on character, and the idea is that obviously our emotional responses are integral to our characters, and the approach then of the kind of Aristotelian Thomist view is certainly that we, if we're going to choose well on a consistent basis, that's not going to be because we're constantly detaching ourselves from the situation and engaging in critical reflection, but that we have learned, we've been habituated into responses that bring together our emotional reactions into our choices. So I can't speak for I can't speak for any individual on the list here. I can simply say that I think the tradition that I'm interested in speaking for is one to which it is very important that we be integrated selves and bring together our emotional lives into our choices and our growth as persons. I think that the issue of so I guess what we might want to say about something like self-sacrifice depends a lot on what we mean by that. I spend some time in the book, and I've spent some time elsewhere suggesting that I think the idea that there's a basic opposition between people's interests is a fairly recent notion. It's a notion that maybe goes back to the 17th century as regards something that's very popular, and that in the long term, I would say the tradition of ethics, at least that I'm writing in, both Christian and classical, sees a fundamental kind of harmony of interests, and sees people and sees choosing if I choose in a way that's beneficial to you, it's not for that reason the case that I'm choosing in a way that's somehow therefore diminishing myself. So I wouldn't want to talk about that even when I do something that involves something quite dramatic. Like Sidney Carton in in A Tale of Two Cities, I step into the line so that I'm the one who's guillotined in place of someone else. That's not, I think, on this. I wouldn't want to use the language of self-sacrifice for that. But let's say that we can identify something that we would talk about as somebody else might use the language of self-sacrifice for, even if it's not, I think maybe the best way to think or talk here. I mean, I certainly think that can be for somebody like Ramsey, a product of covenant faithfulness. It might be for Fletcher, of course, a matter of maximizing the good. It certainly for Tolstoy might be a matter of what we might do loving in the moment. On my view, if something like that happens, it's going to be a product of choosing per the golden rule or choosing in accordance with our commitments. And I certainly don't mean to suppose that would somehow be in any way impossible. And indeed, with respect to Timothy Jackson, whom we've chosen not to talk about, I discuss a bit more of that in particular relation to his views. Finally, I think you're quite right to ask about women thinkers here. The thinkers on this list are not in any way intended to be exhaustive of thinkers who've had useful things to say about love and Christian ethics. And if anything I've said is implied otherwise, I think that's certainly false. This is a list, I think, of people who have in various ways been particularly important as conversation partners in one way or another for me. And I think I've chosen to talk about them because I think their views that I either think it's especially important to distinguish myself from, or they're people from whom I've especially wanted to learn something, not at all because I wanted to suggest that they are exhaustive of the field, or because I think for a moment that people who aren't on this list are somehow less deserving of our attention.
That was necessary. I just need to clarify. That was not the point. I mean, the point is that in virtually all philosophical discussions or ethical discussions, with some exceptions, half of the population is missing. And I think it is important to include them.
Okay, maybe I can say something real quickly here. The reason why we are discussing men is that men were the ones doing the conversations up until very recently. Wrong, that was not right, but it is the case. And particularly bioethics began and was for many years the province of rich, white, Caucasian men interested in high tech. Okay, now there's been an attempt to broaden things out. In the generation following the one that Gary's talking about, in his generation, the generation, pardon me, that Gary's talking about, the leading people were James Gustafson, Paul Ramsey, and Joseph Fletcher. Each of them fostered women to succeed them. So they were the last generation of all white males, and they also fostered people of color. So that was a shift there, a very important shift. One of the most important of the contemporary women Christian ethicists is Lisa Sowell Cahill, and she teaches back at Boston, and she is a high-powered person in the world of ethics. Martha Nussbaum would be another one in the world of ethics that would be really important now, but there haven't been many before that. And Lisa Cahill wrote a very favorable review and comment of Gary's book. So I think it comes full circle here when we have a woman commending something a man wrote.
May I just for a second, Dr. Larson?
Sure.
It's Anastasia. Thank you so much, Dr. Chartier. And of course, you would have to write volumes of books to include everyone. I would like to say one of my disappointments of the book of Sarah Rodden about classicism and Christianity is that she picked only the few things and she did not mention some of the good things and positive things. So here are some women, and I'm going to send you the email, women in the 300s that were extremely influential in Christian ethics. One was the sister of Basil the Great and
Macrina.
Gregory. Macrina, yes. Oh, 60 years in America, I've never met a Protestant that knew the name. So thank you, Dr. Chartier. So, I mean, that was not your focus, but we have, and of course, so many documents have been written. Also, I will send some of the antiquity of women, actually of Athens, exceptional. And they were not Athenians, they were foreigners from other cities of Greece. But as far as Christianity and ethics, yes, Macrina was one of the best. Actually, she is the one that taught her brothers, theologians, etc., etc. And let's not forget, in the Christian, it's a totally different thing. Sometimes we don't, as Protestants, study and that was not your goal, Dr. Chartier, it's not a criticism, is about many of our saints, including Saint Anastasia, the first hero of Christianity, that they were physicians and they tried to heal, and they were very involved into practical kind of agape and so on and so forth. But I enjoy your book very much, and I'm sorry, I was going to bring Macrina, and then I have some list of other people. That was, as we said, way beyond, was like in the 300s of AD, that dealt with some of the ethics, but not with the terminologies we have today. But I want to thank you.
Thank you, Anastasia. Gary, might we turn to your reservations about Jack's position and maybe conclude with that?
Sure. So I think that, again, I begin here as a friendly critic. So the several things that I note here in the book in talking about Jack. So first of all, I think by suggesting that we focus on what sustains or impedes creative love, I think that Jack treats one good, a good that I've elsewhere called practical wisdom, as the master good, as what's really important. And I think that good is very important, but practical wisdom isn't the only thing that's important. And indeed, exercising practical wisdom, I think, requires the availability of other possible goods among which we are choosing. And so I hesitate then to treat practical wisdom on its own as central to the degree that I think Jack does. So that's one observation. So I think that means recognizing a broader range of goods. And I think given Jack's emphasis on creation and the fact that as we are created, there are various ways in which we flourish, various kinds of goods that we experience. It seems to me that it's not a stretch. It wouldn't be a stretch for Jack to take that into account, but it's not the case very explicitly in the position he's got as he develops it. So, secondly, I think once we allow that there are other goods that might be worth pursuing, I guess I think it's not obvious why the fact that a given action affects practical wisdom in a particular way should be decisive as regards the moral status of that action, right? So it's not consistent with love, I think, to intend to attack the exercise of the capacity for practical wisdom, but there might be various activities that could be, as I say here, kind of orthogonal to the exercise of practical wisdom, and some of them might unintendedly, but still foreseeably impede its exercise without proving inconsistent with love, because they don't involve any deliberate attack on it. Another thing I guess I would say is that Jack seems to think we can choose in a kind of maximizing way. So he doesn't think that there's, the ability necessarily to do this as regards something we might call welfare or well-being, but perhaps that we can choose, quote, the most loving action as that which most enhances in a given case the capacity for creative freedom in love. And it seems like if the different instances of our exercise of this good of practical wisdom, practical judgment are again qualitatively different, they're incommensurable, then I'm not sure that that's possible. Another thing, I guess, I would want to say, which is a little more subtle or complex, but I think is important. I don't think Jack sees himself as trying to dramatically revise common morality. But I don't think it's obvious that an approach that focuses on this capacity for creative love, creative freedom, captures what's going on with common morality perfectly, right? So consider, say, ingratitude to parents or disloyalty to a marriage partner. If we agree that these things are wrong, it's not obvious that what's wrong about them, certainly at any rate, that what's centrally wrong about them is that they lessen anybody's capacity for creative freedom, or that they involve insufficient regard for or willingness to exercise our own creative freedom. Now, I'm not saying that we couldn't tell a story in a particular case in which ingratitude to parents or disloyalty to a partner might involve some sort of disregard for creative freedom, but I don't think that's really central there. It doesn't seem, therefore, to really capture what's going on. And indeed, good judgment doesn't always have to be creative. I think, as I tried to suggest a moment ago, I think habit is just fine much of the time. And indeed, that's part of being, I think, a well-developed person, that we have good habits. But I don't think we want to regard treating or the capacity for creative freedom as the only principle that matters as what's really significant. It matters, but I don't think it's the only thing. I also think that we need to think more about what Jack has to say about creation. He really sees this as central, but I think we need to think more about what's going on there. So, for instance, I think his understanding of the ethics of creation can sometimes bring creation and agape, as he understands it, agape facilitation, into potential conflict. So take the case that when Jack rejects what he takes to be overly ambitious biotechnological undertakings by insisting, quote, it is an act of high blasphemy for human creatures to attempt to usurp the role of their creator. So this doesn't sound very much like a matter of protecting creative freedom. It sounds more like it's somehow impious as a kind of disturbance of the order of things rooted in the work of the creator, and how he might want to resolve the seeming tension there with that concern with creative freedom, it seems to me deserves more attention. So then I think what else? We certainly want to say more about the image of God and how we might think about that, and whether we want to go precisely where Jack does, I'm not sure. It seems to me that certainly the capacity for creative freedom is evidence of moral standing, but I suggest here that we might think about the capacity to appreciate being the recipient of the exercise of creative freedom might matter. That might be a cleaner way of thinking about this, and that might then be relevant to how we think about non-human creatures, not just as symbols of those who bear the image of God, but is in one way or another moral patients capable of receiving creative love. On the other hand, I spend some time here, and I think we're not going to have anything like time to talk about this. We've got 3 minutes to be done. But I spend some time here wondering whether Jack gives too much credit to non-sentient realities, to realities that aren't that don't think or feel at all as enjoying any kind of moral standing. And it seems to me that that doesn't fit comfortably with his approach. And I think we ought to look skeptically at it, but I don't think we have time to talk much about that now. So we've probably run out of time for me to say much about Jack here. So let me, Dave, if I can, invite you to wrap things up.
Okay, thank you, Gary. We've worked you very hard today, and I hope you get some rest for the rest of the Sabbath.
Will
and
do.
The discussion will continue. Next week, we will be talking about ecology and adventist resources for ecological responsibility. And Warren Trenchard will lead us. That's on the 17th. On the 24th, our group will meet with the Jim Walters group, that is Sabbath seminars, because they typically have a musical program on the Sabbath closest to Christmas, and they invite us, and so we're going to join them again. Then, of course, December 31 is our book fest. So if you haven't been reading, it's time to start reading so that you can share with a larger group what you have read, what you read a long time ago, what you hope to read, and what you hope never to read, and why that is the case. So here is the benediction. The Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face to shine upon you and be gracious to you. The Lord lift up his countenance upon you and give you peace. Amen.
Amen.
Okay, I'm stopping the recording.